Young schoolteacher defied a town sheriff. Until the scandal revealed he was her father, she thought the corrupt sheriff was her enemy. Until she realized the blood on his hands might be the same blood running through her veins. The stagecoach wheels carved fresh scars into Millfield's dusty main street as Clara Morrison stepped down into the dying light of October. Her black traveling dress hung loose on her thin frame, and her brown leather satchel contained everything she owned in this world: 3 books, 2 dresses, and her mother's worn Bible. The driver tossed her trunk to the ground without ceremony and drove away, leaving her standing alone in a town that felt like the edge of nowhere. Millfield stretched before her like a collection of broken promises. The buildings leaned into each other as if they were too tired to stand straight, their paint peeling like old skin in the desert heat. Dust moved through the streets like ghosts, settling on everything with the weight of forgotten dreams. Clara pulled her shawl tight and walked toward the boarding house, her heels clicking against the wooden sidewalk in a rhythm that seemed too loud for this quiet place. The one-room schoolhouse sat at the end of the street like an afterthought, its windows dark and empty. Clara had traveled 800 miles to teach in this place, answering an advertisement that promised a chance to shape young minds in God's country. Now, looking at the sagging roof and broken front step, she wondered if God had forgotten about this particular corner of his creation. That night at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Clara learned about Sheriff Wade Garrett over a dinner of beans and hardtack. "He keeps the peace," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice careful and low. "Collects taxes for the county. Make sure folks stay in line." But Clara saw the way the older woman's hands shook when she spoke his name. She noticed how the Mexican families lived in shacks on the wrong side of the creek, how their children wore clothes patched with different colors, how they walked with their eyes down when they came to town for supplies. Clara had grown up poor herself back in Missouri. She knew the look of hunger, the sound of fear, the way injustice settled into a place like dust in the corners. Her mother had scrubbed floors and taken in washing to send Clara to the teacher's college, had died with her hands still red from lye soap and her back bent from years of hard work. Clara carried that sacrifice with her like a flame in her chest, and she'd sworn she'd never let it burn in vain. The first morning of school, 12 children came. 8 were Mexican, their clothes clean but worn, their faces bright with hope that made Clara's heart ache. The other 4 belonged to the town's shopkeepers, their parents sending them more from habit than enthusiasm. Clara arranged the wooden desks in a circle and began with simple arithmetic, watching as the children's faces lit up with understanding. She was teaching them to read from her mother's Bible when Sheriff Wade Garrett arrived. He filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his silver badge catching the morning light. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes. His gun hung heavy on his hip, and his boots were dusty from hard riding. But it was his eyes that stopped Clara cold, gray as winter sky, cold as creek water, and carrying a sadness that seemed older than the desert itself. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Heard you were teaching the Mexican children." Clara stood slowly, her hands steady on the Bible. "I'm teaching all the children who come to learn, Sheriff. Some folks might not like that. Might cause trouble." The children sat frozen at their desks, understanding the danger, even if they couldn't follow all the words. Clara felt their fear like heat from a fire, and something hard settled in her chest. "The only trouble I see," she said, "is children going without education." Sheriff Garrett's eyes narrowed. "You're new here, Mississippi. You don't understand how things work. Understand that every child deserves to read and write and cipher numbers. I understand that knowledge doesn't care what color a person's skin is or where their family comes from." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. Clara could hear her heart beating, could smell the dust and leather and something else, something like old pain, like regret that had been carried too long. "Be careful, Miss Morrison," Sheriff Garrett said finally. "This town can be hard on people who don't fit in." That afternoon, Clara walked to the Mexican settlement by the creek. The houses were small and simple, built from adobe and hope, with gardens where families grew beans and corn and chiles that reminded them of home. She knocked on doors and spoke in her careful Spanish, learned from a book during the long train ride west. She told mothers and fathers that their children were welcome in her school, that education was a gift no one could take away. But she also heard the stories. How Sheriff Garrett collected taxes that never seemed to make it to the county office. How families who couldn't pay lost their land or their livestock. How anyone who complained found themselves facing trumped-up charges or worse. "He is not a good man," said Maria Santos, an old woman whose husband had disappeared after questioning one of Garrett's collections. "But he is a powerful man. Be careful, Maestra." The confrontation came 3 days later. Clara was walking back from the settlement when she saw Sheriff Garrett and 2 deputies surrounding the Martinez family's wagon. Pedro Martinez stood with his hat in his hands while his wife clutched their baby close. The sheriff was speaking in low, hard tones about overdue payments and consequences. Clara didn't think. She walked straight into the circle of men, her heart hammering but her voice steady. "Sheriff Garrett," she said, "is there some trouble here?" The big man turned, his face dark with anger. "This is official business, Miss Morrison. Move along." "The Martinez family has children in my school," Clara said. "If there's trouble that might affect them, it's my concern too." "Your concern," Sheriff Garrett said, stepping closer, "is teaching letters and numbers. Nothing else." Clara looked up at him, at the cold gray eyes and the mouth set hard as stone. But she also saw something else, something that flickered just for a moment. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper. Something that looked almost like recognition. "My concern," she said, "is seeing that children don't go hungry because their parents are being robbed by men with badges." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. The deputies shifted nervously, their hands moving toward their weapons. Pedro Martinez made a small, frightened sound. Sheriff Garrett's face went white, then red. His hand dropped to his gun, and for a moment Clara thought she might die right there in the dusty street. But then something changed in his expression, some wall coming down or going up, she couldn't tell which. "Get in your wagon, Martinez," he said without taking his eyes off Clara. "You've got until Friday." The family scrambled to obey, Pedro helping his wife and baby up while casting grateful glances at Clara. The wagon rolled away in a cloud of dust, leaving Clara alone with 3 armed men and the weight of her own foolish courage. "You just made a mistake, schoolmarm," one of the deputies said. But Sheriff Garrett held up his hand, still staring at Clara with those storm cloud eyes. "Friday, Miss Morrison," he said quietly. "Think about what you can live with." As he walked away, Clara noticed something that made her blood run cold. The way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his head when he was thinking, it reminded her of something. Someone. It reminded her of herself, looking in her mother's old mirror. That night, alone in her small room at the boarding house, Clara pulled out her mother's Bible and opened it to the family page where births and deaths were recorded and faded. Her finger traced the lines her mother had written so carefully. Clara Elizabeth Morrison, born October 15th, 1851, father unknown. For the first time in her 23 years, Clara wondered what unknown really meant. The lamp flickered in Clara's small room as she stared at those 2 words, father unknown, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Outside, the wind carried the sound of Sheriff Garrett's boots on the wooden sidewalk, walking his evening rounds. She closed the Bible and blew out the lamp, but sleep wouldn't come. In the darkness, questions stirred like dust devils, and Clara Morrison began to wonder if some secrets were buried so deep they could shake the very ground beneath a person's feet. She taught them courage by day, but at night, she discovered the sheriff who terrorized their town carried a photograph that would shatter everything she believed about her past. The Friday deadline came and went like smoke on the wind. Pedro Martinez appeared at Clara's schoolhouse door that morning, hat in hand but chin raised high. The sheriff, he came for his money, Pedro said in careful English. "I told him what you said, that a man should not pay twice for the same land." Clara's heart stopped. What happened? He rode away. Just rode away. Pedro's weathered face broke into a smile that could have lit the whole desert. My Maria, she says you have the courage of 10 men, maestra. Word spread through Millfield's dusty streets like water through parched ground. The schoolteacher had faced down Wade Garrett and lived to tell about it. By afternoon, Clara noticed the difference. Mexican families walked with their heads up. Shopkeepers met her eyes when she passed. Children ran to her with wildflowers picked from the creek bank. But she also noticed the way Sheriff Garrett's deputies watch her now, their eyes hard as flint. The way conversations stopped when she entered the general store. The way Mrs. Henderson served her supper without meeting her gaze. You're playing with fire, girl, the older woman whispered one evening as she refilled Clara's coffee cup. Wade Garrett ain't a man to cross. Clara looked out the window at the empty street, at the yellow squares of lamplight in distant windows. Maybe this town's been afraid long enough. That night, she stayed late at the schoolhouse, preparing lessons by candlelight. She was writing arithmetic problems on the slate board when she heard it. Footsteps on the wooden porch, slow and deliberate. Her hand froze on the chalk as the door creaked open. Sheriff Garrett stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, his face hidden in shadow. He stepped inside without invitation, his spurs jangling softly on the plank floor. In the flickering candlelight, he looked older, more tired, the lines around his eyes carved deeper by exhaustion. Working late, he said. Children need education regardless of the hour. Clara kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Education. He spoke the word like it tasted strange. My pa never saw the use in it. Said books were for soft men and foolish women. Your father was wrong. Sheriff Garrett moved closer, and Clara caught his scent, leather and tobacco, and something else, something clean like soap and saddle oil. He was studying her face with those winter-gray eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had been troubling him for years. You remind me of someone, he said quietly. A lot of school teachers probably look alike to you. No, the word came out rougher than he'd intended. Not a school teacher. Clara set down the chalk, her fingers trembling slightly. Then who? But Sheriff Garrett had already turned away, moving toward the door like a man fleeing his own shadow. Be careful, Miss Morrison. This town has a way of breaking people who think they can fix it. After he left, Clara sat alone in the candlelit schoolhouse, her mother's Bible open in her lap. She'd been reading the same verse over and over. The truth shall make you free. But freedom, she was learning, could be a heavier burden than any chain. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Doc Peterson arrived at the schoolhouse with a split lip and his left arm cradled against his chest. Behind him came Martha Kowalski, the baker's wife, with a purple bruise spreading across her cheek like spilled ink. Garrett's boys, Doc Peterson said, wincing as Clara helped him to a chair. Seems the good sheriff didn't appreciate us treating folks without his permission. Permission? Clara's voice rose sharp enough to cut glass. Martha dabbed at her swollen lip with a torn handkerchief. Deputy Hawkins said we were interfering with official business. Said anyone who helps the Mexican families is working against the law. Clara felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She looked at the children seated at their desks, their dark eyes wide with fear and confusion. Pedro Martinez's youngest daughter, Esperanza, raised her small hand. Maestra, she whispered, are we in trouble? No, Mija, Clara said, kneeling beside the 6-year-old's desk. You are not in trouble. You have done nothing wrong. But even as she spoke the words, Clara knew they weren't entirely true. In Wade Garrett's world, existing was crime enough for some people. Being different was reason enough for punishment. That afternoon, Clara made a decision that would echo through the rest of her life. She walked to every house in the Mexican settlement, to every shop on Main Street, to every farm within 5 miles of town. She knocked on doors and spoke to wives hanging laundry, to men repairing fences, to grandmothers shelling beans in the evening light. We meet tomorrow night, she told them all, at the schoolhouse. It's time to talk about what kind of town we want this to be. 37 people came. They filled the small schoolhouse to bursting, standing along the walls, sitting on the floor, holding babies and whispering prayers. Clara looked out at their faces, brown and white and weathered by sun and wind, young and old, marked by hard work and harder choices. Sheriff Garrett says he keeps the peace, Clara began. But what kind of peace requires a man to pay taxes twice? What kind of peace beats a doctor for treating sick children? What kind of peace drives families from their homes? A murmur ran through the crowd. Pedro Martinez stood up, his hat clutched in his calloused hands. What do you want us to do, Maestra? He has guns. He has the law. He has fear, Clara said. And fear only works if we let it. She outlined her plan simply. They would refuse to pay Garrett's illegal taxes. They would stand together when he came collecting. They would document every abuse, every theft, every act of violence, and send word to the territorial governor. It's dangerous, she admitted. He'll fight back. People might get hurt. An old man named Santos Morales raised his weathered hand. Maestra, we are already hurt, already afraid. Maybe it is time to be afraid together instead of alone. As the meeting broke up, Clara noticed a figure watching from across the street. Sheriff Garrett sat his horse in the shadows between buildings, perfectly still, perfectly silent. When their eyes met across the distance, neither moved for a long moment. Then he touched his hat brim, not quite a salute, not quite a threat, and rode into the darkness. Clara was cleaning the blackboard when she found it. A folded piece of paper tucked behind the chalk ledge, placed there by hand she hadn't seen. Her name was written on the outside in careful script that looked like it had been practiced many times. Inside, in the same careful handwriting, some things are buried for good reason. Some secrets protect more than they hide. Be careful what truths you dig up, Margaret's girl. The paper fell from Clara's numb fingers. Margaret's girl. Her mother's name had been Margaret. Margaret Morrison, who had died 3 years ago in their tiny house in Missouri, who had scrubbed floors and taken in washing and never once spoken to Clara's father except to say he was gone. Clara sank in her desk chair, her legs suddenly weak. The implications crashed over her like a flash flood in the desert. Sheriff Garrett knew her mother, had known her well enough to recognize something of Margaret in Clara's face, in her voice, in the stubborn set of her shoulders. Outside, the wind rattled the schoolhouse windows and sent tumbleweeds dancing down the empty street. Clara folded the note carefully and tucked it in her Bible, next to the family page where Father Unknown was written in her mother's fading ink. But now she wondered if unknown had been less about ignorance and more about protection. If her mother had carried secrets heavier than any washing basket, had chosen silence over truth for reasons Clara was only beginning to understand. 20 miles outside of town, in a cabin that smelled of whiskey and regret, Sheriff Wade Garrett sat at his kitchen table with a daguerreotype in his hands. The photograph showed a young woman with dark hair and storm cloud eyes, wearing a white dress and a smile that could have lit up the whole territory. On the back, in faded ink, Margaret Morrison, 1850. He'd carried this picture for 24 years, through 3 different towns and a dozen different mistakes. Had pulled it out on cold nights and empty mornings, studying every line of Margaret's face until he could draw it from memory. She'd been 19 when the picture was taken, 20 when she'd agreed to marry him, 21 when she disappeared in the night like smoke from a dying fire. The resemblance was unmistakable now. The schoolteacher had Margaret's eyes, Margaret's voice, Margaret's way of tilting her chin when she was angry. She was the right age, carried the right name, fought with the same fierce determination that had made him fall in love with her mother all those years ago. Margaret's daughter. His daughter. The thought should have filled him with joy, or at least relief. Instead, it sat in his chest like a stone, because Wade Garrett knew what kind of man he'd become in the 24 years since Margaret Morrison had left him standing at the altar. Knew what his badge had been used for, what his guns had done, what compromises he'd made with men who traded in fear and violence. He was no fit father for Margaret's girl. No fit father for anyone. Garrett put the photograph back in his desk drawer, next to the bottle of whiskey that had been his closest companion for longer than he cared to remember. Tomorrow, Clara Morrison would continue her crusade against everything he'd built in this town. Tomorrow, he'd have to decide whether to be the sheriff Millfield expected or something else entirely. The lamp burned low in Garrett's cabin as he sat staring at the closed desk drawer, knowing that sleep wouldn't come easy with so many ghosts stirring in the shadows. Across town, Clara Morrison lay awake too, her mother's Bible open to pages that suddenly seemed full of questions instead of answers. Neither father nor daughter slept well that night, each carrying half of a truth that would soon demand to be made whole, no matter the cost. When the schoolteacher's student lay bleeding in her arms, she saw a fury in the sheriff's eyes that matched her own, and in that moment of shared rage, 24 years of buried secrets began to surface. The morning of the stand came gray and cold, with November wind howling down from the mountains like a warning from God himself. Clara stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun struggle to break through clouds that hung low and heavy as unspoken prayers. Today would change everything. She could feel it in her bones the way her mother had always felt coming storms. By 8 o'clock, they had gathered in the town square, 37 souls who had decided that dignity was worth dying for. The Mexican families stood with their children pressed close, while the shopkeepers and farmers formed a loose circle around them. Clara moved among them like a general preparing for battle, checking faces, squeezing hands, whispering words of courage. She wasn't sure she believed herself. Remember, she told them, we are not here to fight. We are here to stand. When Sheriff Garrett comes for his money, we say no together. We document what happens. We show the world what justice looks like in Millfield. Santos Morales, the old man whose hand shook but whose voice never wavered, stepped forward. And if he brings guns, Maestra? Clara looked at the faces around her, weathered by wind and sun, marked by worry and hope in equal measure. These were people who had buried children and survived droughts, who had crossed deserts and built homes from nothing but determination and prayer. They deserved better than to live in fear of a badge worn by a man who had forgotten the difference between law and tyranny. Then we show him that some things are worth more than life, she said. Sheriff Wade Garrett appeared at 10 o'clock sharp, riding down Main Street with his 2 deputies flanking him like harbingers of judgment. His horse was a big gray stallion that moved with the controlled power of barely leashed violence. Deputy Hawkins rode to his right, hand already resting on his gun, but Deputy Morrison, a thin, nervous man with eyes like a cornered animal, kept checking the windows above the shops, as if expecting snipers. The crowd parted as the 3 men dismounted, their spurs ringing against the wooden sidewalk like small bells tolling a funeral march. Clara stepped forward, her heart hammering but her voice steady as church stone. Sheriff Garrett, she said, we need to talk. Miss Morrison. His voice carried no warmth, no recognition of the nights they'd spent circling each other like wounded animals. You're interfering with official business. Official business? Clara gestured to the families behind her. Taking money from people who barely have enough to feed their children? That's not official business, Sheriff. That's robbery. Deputy Hawkins stepped forward, his hand dropping to his gun. You watch your mouth, schoolmarm. But Garrett raised his hand, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. In the gray morning light, those eyes looked ancient, tired, carrying more weight than any man should have to bear. You don't understand how things work here, Miss Morrison. I understand perfectly. Clara's voice rose, cutting through the cold air like a blade. I understand that you've been bleeding this town dry for years. I understand that you use fear and violence to keep people quiet. I understand that you've forgotten what that badge is supposed to mean. Something flickered across Garrett's face. Pain, maybe, or recognition. He looked at the crowd behind Clara, at the children peering out from behind their parents' legs, at the men and women who had finally found courage enough to stand together. These people owe taxes, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Show us the papers, Clara demanded. Show us the official county documents that authorize these collections. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled to breaking. Garrett's jaw worked as if he were chewing words too bitter to swallow. Finally, Deputy Hawkins spoke up. "We don't need to show you nothing, lady. Sheriff says they owe. That's not how law works," Clara shot back. "That's how tyranny works." "Tyranny?" Deputy Hawkins laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Lady, you don't know what tyranny looks like." "I know what courage looks like," Clara said, turning to face the crowd. "And I see it in every person standing here today." That's when young Pablo Martinez stepped forward. He was only 12 years old, the second youngest of Clara's students, with bright dark eyes and a smile that could charm birds from trees. His English was still broken, mixed with Spanish words when he got excited or scared, but his heart was pure as creek water. He carried a piece of paper in his small hands, a drawing he'd made in school, showing Sheriff Garrett as a monster with fangs and claws. "Maestra," he said, his voice high and clear in the cold air. "I made this for you." Clara took the drawing, her throat tight with emotion. On the paper, Pablo had drawn himself and his family standing tall while the monster sheriff cowered in a corner. At the bottom, in careful letters, "Courage is stronger than fear." "It's beautiful, Pablo," Clara whispered. Deputy Hawkins snatched the paper from her hands, studied it with growing anger. "You teaching these kids to disrespect the law. I'm teaching them to think for themselves. You're teaching them to be rebels and troublemakers." Hawkins crumpled the drawing and threw it in the dirt. "Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson about respect." He reached for Clara's arm, but Pedro Martinez stepped between them. "You do not touch the maestra. Get out of my way, greaser." "Papa." "No." Pablo cried, running toward his father. What happened next would haunt Clara's dreams for the rest of her life. Deputy Hawkins, startled by the boy's sudden movement, drew his gun. The weapon discharged with a sound like thunder, the bullet catching Pablo in the chest and spinning him to the ground like a broken doll. The world went silent. Not quiet, silent, as if God himself had stopped breathing. Clara looked down at Pablo, at the bright red blood spreading across his small chest, at his eyes wide with confusion and fear. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against the wound, feeling his life running warm between her fingers. "Pablo," she whispered, "stay with me, Mijo. Stay with me." The boy's lips moved, trying to form words. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth, and his small hand found Clara's wrist, gripping with desperate strength. "Maestra, did we win?" Tears streamed down Clara's face as she held him close. "Yes, Pablo, we won. We won because you were brave." That's when Sheriff Garrett arrived at her side. He dropped to his knees in the dust, his hands shaking as he looked at the wounded boy. For a moment, his carefully constructed mask fell away, and Clara saw something that made her heart stop. She saw grief, deep and old and familiar. She saw a rage that matched her own, burning in eyes the same color as storm clouds. She saw a man looking at a dying child and seeing all the ways he had failed. "Doc Peterson," Garrett shouted, his voice cracking. "Someone get Doc Peterson." But Clara was studying his face, seeing past the beard and the lines and the years of hard living. Seeing the shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands moved when he was afraid. Recognition hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the world tilt sideways. She knew those hands, had seen them in her own reflection, in the mirror her mother had kept on their kitchen table. Had inherited the same long fingers, the same way of gesturing when upset, the same tremor when fear took hold. "My God," she whispered. Garrett's eyes met hers across Pablo's still form, and she saw that he knew. Had always known, from the first moment he'd seen her standing in that schoolhouse doorway. The truth sat between them like a living thing, terrible and undeniable. "Clara," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer, like a curse, like 24 years of regret made audible. But there was no time for recognition, no space for the conversation that had been waiting 2 decades to be born. Pablo Martinez was dying in Clara's arms, and Deputy Hawkins was standing over them with his smoking gun, looking more surprised than sorry. "It was an accident," Hawkins said, his voice high and strange. "The kid ran at me. I thought he had a weapon." "He's 12 years old," Clara said, her voice deadly quiet. "Mexican kids grow up fast out here. They're dangerous." Sheriff Garrett was on his feet before Hawkins could finish the sentence, his fist connecting with his deputy's jaw with a sound like breaking wood. Hawkins went down hard, his gun flying from his hand to land in the dust beside Pablo's crumpled drawing. "You son of a bitch," Garrett snarled, standing over his fallen deputy. He was a child. The crowd pressed closer, their voices rising in anger, and Clara could feel the situation spinning toward violence, could see guns appearing in hands that had never held them before. In a few moments, Millfield's main street would run red with blood, and Pablo Martinez would not be the only child to die in the dust. "Stop," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This is what he wants. This is how tyrants stay in power. They make us become what we hate." She looked up at Sheriff Garrett, at the man whose blood ran in her veins, whose mistakes had shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. "What kind of lawman are you going to be today?" For a long moment, Garrett stared down at her, his face a map of internal war. Then he reached for his badge, unpinning it from his vest with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "The kind who remembers what this was supposed to mean," he said, and threw the badge into the dust beside his fallen deputy. Doc Peterson arrived at a run, his medical bag bouncing against his hip. He knelt beside Pablo without a word, his practiced hands moving over the boy's chest with gentle efficiency. After what felt like hours, he looked up at Clara. "He'll live," he said simply. But it was close. Clara closed her eyes and felt 24 years of questions pressing against her chest like stones. When she opened them again, Sheriff Wade Garrett was walking away down Main Street. No longer a sheriff, no longer sure what he was at all. The badge lay in the dust where he dropped it, catching the pale November sun like a fallen star. That night, as Pablo Martinez fought fever dreams in Doc Peterson's clinic and the town of Millfield tried to make sense of a day that had changed everything, Clara sat alone in her room with her mother's Bible open in her lap. The family page stared back at her, and for the first time in her life, the words "Father Unknown" seemed less like an ending and more like a beginning. Outside her window, she could see a lone figure sitting on the steps of a jail, head in his hands, no longer wearing the badge that had defined him for so many years. Some truths she was learning were too big to fit in the space between one heartbeat and the next. When her dying mother finally whispered the truth about her father, Clara realized she'd been fighting the one man who'd spent 24 years trying to protect her from becoming what he had become. Winter came to Millfield like a penitent, quiet and clean, covering the town's scars with snow that made everything look new again. Clara stood at her classroom window, watching snowflakes drift past the glass like tiny prayers, and thought about the letter that had changed everything. It had arrived 3 weeks after the shooting, carried by a circuit rider who'd stopped to water his horse. The envelope was yellowed with age, addressed to Clara in handwriting she recognized as her mother's. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper thin as butterfly wings, were 5 more letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Clara had waited until dark to read them, sitting by candlelight in her small room at the boarding house. The first letter was dated October 1850, when her mother would have been 19. "My dearest Wade, I know you will be angry when you read this. I know you will curse my name and think me faithless. But please understand, I am not leaving because I do not love you. I am leaving because I do. The child I carry is yours, and she deserves better than to grow up in the shadow of what you are becoming. I see the darkness creeping into your eyes, my darling. I see how the badge weighs heavier on your chest each day, how the gun feels more familiar in your hand than my fingers in yours. You are a good man, Wade Garrett, but goodness is not enough in a world that rewards cruelty. I will not watch you become the thing you hate. I will not let our daughter see her father turn into a monster. Do not look for us. Do not follow. Love us enough to let us go. Forever yours, Clara's hands had shaken as she read, tears blurring the carefully written words. The other letters told the story of her mother's long flight east, of working in kitchens and laundries, of raising a daughter alone while watching the newspapers for any mention of Sheriff Wade Garrett, and the choices he was making in towns whose names became synonymous with violence. The last letter was dated just 3 months before her mother's death. My Clara, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you have questions I was too coward to answer well. Your father is not dead, as I let you believe. He is Sheriff Wade Garrett of Millfield, Arizona Territory, and he is both the best man and the worst man I have ever known. I loved him with everything I had, and I feared him just as much. By the time I left him, he was already becoming something hard and terrible, shaped by violence and compromise. I could not stay to watch him finish that transformation. I could not let you grow up thinking that love meant accepting cruelty. But perhaps I was wrong to take you from him. Perhaps love should have meant staying and fighting for his soul instead of protecting yours. I will never know. If fate brings you to him, be careful, my daughter. He will recognize you. You have his eyes and his stubborn heart. But remember that 24 years is a long time for a man to live with his mistakes. Some things cannot be undone, only forgiven. Your loving mother, Margaret Morrison Clara, had sat with those letters until dawn, feeling the careful architecture of her life crumble and rebuild itself around this new truth. Sheriff Wade Garrett, the man she defied, the man who'd terrorized her students, the man who'd thrown away his badge to kneel beside a dying child, was her father. Now, 3 weeks later, she was ready to face him. She found him where she somehow knew she would, sitting on the steps of the abandoned jail, whittling a piece of pine wood with hands that shook slightly in the cold. He'd aged 10 years in the weeks since the shooting, his hair gone mostly gray, his face carved with new lines. He wore no badge, carried no gun, looked like nothing so much as a man who'd lost his way home. I wondered when you'd come, he said without looking up from his carving. Clara sat beside him on the cold wooden steps, close enough to see what he was making. A small horse, carved with the careful detail of someone who had too much time and too many regrets. It's for Pablo, he said. Boy's got to stay in bed another month while his chest heals. Thought he might like something to play with. The simple kindness of it broke something open in Clara's chest. She pulled the bundle of letters from her coat pocket and set them on the step between them. She never forgot you, Clara said quietly. Garrett's hands stilled on the carving. He looked at the letters, at the blue ribbon that had faded to the color of old sky, and Clara saw 24 years of wondering finally come to an end. She was right to leave, he said. I was becoming something she shouldn't have had to love. Maybe. But she did love you. Right to the end, Garrett picked up the letters with hands that trembled like dried leaves. You read them, all of them. She was afraid of what you were becoming, but she never stopped hoping you'd find your way back to who you used to be. And did I? The question came out rough, like it had been scraped across broken glass. Clara studied his face, the face that was so like her own, marked by choices and time and the weight of carrying other people's pain. I don't know who you used to be. I only know who you are now. A man who let his deputies terrorize innocent people. A man who took money from families who could barely feed their children. A man who threw away his badge to help a wounded child, Clara interrupted. A man who carved a toy horse for a boy he barely knows. A man who's been sitting on these steps for 3 weeks, trying to figure out how to make amends for 24 years of mistakes. They sat in silence as snow began to fall again, dusting their shoulders and the letters between them with white that looked like forgiveness. Finally, Garrett spoke. What happens now? Clara thought of her mother's words, of love and fear tangled together like thorns and roses. She thought of Pablo Martinez learning to walk again, of the Mexican families who no longer bowed their heads when they came to town, of a badge lying in the dust, and what it might mean to pick it up again. Now we figure out what kind of people we want to be, she said. The transformation of Millfield didn't happen overnight. It came slow as spring thaw, in small acts of courage and larger gestures of grace. Clara continued teaching, but now her classroom overflowed with children whose parents no longer feared retribution for seeking education. The Mexican families began to prosper, their small farms and businesses growing under the protection of a new kind of law. Wade Garrett never wore a badge again, but he became something better than a sheriff. He became a protector without authority, a keeper of peace without the power to enforce it through violence. He mediated disputes with words instead of weapons, helped settle debts fairly instead of collecting them corruptly, and slowly, painfully slowly, earned back the trust he'd spent years destroying. They worked together, father and daughter, but carefully, respectfully, with a measured distance of two people learning to love across a chasm of lost years. They never spoke of it directly, this relationship that couldn't quite be named. Clara never called him father, and he never claimed the title. But sometimes on quiet Sunday afternoons, they would sit together on the schoolhouse steps and talk about books and weather and the small miracles of ordinary days. Spring arrived early that year, painting the desert in colors that seemed too bright for a world that had seen so much pain. Clara stood in the town's cemetery, placing wildflowers on a grave that held only memory. Her mother had been buried in Missouri, but grief needed a place to rest, and this spot beneath the cottonwood tree felt right. "She would have been proud of you," Wade Garrett said quietly. Clara turned to find him standing at the edge of the cemetery, hat in his hands, keeping the respectful distance that had become their way. He looked older in the bright spring light, but also somehow lighter, as if laying down the weight of his badge had freed him to carry more important things. "Of both of us, maybe," Clara said. "I don't know about that. I've got a lot of years to make up for." "You've got time." Clara gathered up the remaining flowers, their bright petals soft as hope between her fingers. "We both do." Pablo Martinez appeared at the cemetery gate, walking slowly but steadily, no longer needing the cane Doc Peterson had carved for him. His mother followed, close behind, her face bright with the particular joy that comes from watching a child heal. "Maestra," Pablo called, his voice strong and clear. Look, I can run again." He demonstrated with a few careful steps that were more hop than run, but his smile could have lit up the entire territory. Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the desert air like music, and Wade Garrett found himself smiling too. The first real smile he'd worn in more years than he could count. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky the color of forgiveness, Clara Morrison sat on her porch at the boarding house and read from her mother's Bible. The family page was still there, still marked with the words "Father Unknown," but now those words felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of a story too large and complicated to fit in the margins of any. Across town, Wade Garrett sat on the steps of what used to be the jail, carving another wooden horse. This one for Pablo's little sister, who had started coming to Clara's school and showing the same bright curiosity that made her brother such a joy to teach. His hands moved with practiced ease, shaping something beautiful from something plain, and if that wasn't redemption, it was at least a step in the right direction. The desert wind carried the scent of rain and growing things, and Millfield settled into its evening rhythms with the quiet satisfaction of a town that had learned the difference between peace and fear. Some stories, Clara thought, don't end with dramatic gestures or grand declarations. Some stories end with small kindnesses repeated day after day, with forgiveness measured not in moments but in years, with love that grows patient and careful in the space between what was lost and what might yet be. In the distance, a mockingbird sang its complicated song, borrowing melodies from wrens and hawks and meadowlarks, weaving them all together into something new and entirely its own. Clara closed her eyes and listened, thinking of her mother and the letters that had finally brought truth home, thinking of a badge thrown down in dust and picked up again in the form of something better. When she opened her eyes, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Wade Garrett was walking slowly past the boarding house on his evening rounds. not as a sheriff, but as a man who had finally learned that protection was not about power, but about presence. He touched his hat brim as he passed, and Clara nodded in return. And in that simple exchange lay all the complicated love and careful forgiveness that would carry them both through whatever years remained. The desert had patience for such things. Time moved differently here, measured not in minutes, but in seasons, in the slow transformation of stone into sand, in the gradual healing of wounds too deep for any medicine except grace. And if grace was what they had found, father and daughter, stranger and familiar, the man who had lost his way and the woman who had helped him find it, then perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was everything. The mockingbird's song faded into the gentle sounds of evening. Horses settling in their stalls, children being called home for supper, the soft murmur of neighbors sharing the day's small victories and sorrows. Clara Morrison closed her mother's Bible and went inside, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new chances to choose courage over fear. And somewhere in the darkness, Wade Garrett continued his patient rounds, watching over a town that had learned to sleep peacefully again, carrying in his heart the weight and wonder of being, finally, the man his daughter could respect, and maybe, someday, the father she could forgive.